Okay, so good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everyone, depending on where and when in the world you're joining us from. I'm delighted to welcome you to today's event hosted by the Azrieli Institute of Israel Studies. My name is Csaba Nikolenyi, and I'm the director of the institute, also a professor of political science at Concordia University. I'm just so delighted to be able to bring to you a very special person, a very special author, entrepreneur, presenter, who is going to show us and introduce us to a side and face of Israel that we've been hearing more and more about over the recent years, but never really to the kind of depth and to the kind of and level of detail that we are going to be introduced to today. Our friend here at the Institute today is Mr. Avi Jorisch, and Avi is going to tell us about his some of the key arguments, key findings in his recent book, Thou Shalt Innovate. Before I would turn the floor over to Avi, please just indulge me for a couple of minutes so that I would share some of the major pointers in Avi's biography with you. So Avi holds a bachelor's degree in history from Binghamton University, and he's also a holder of a master's degree in Islamic history from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He has also studied Arabic and Islamic philosophy at the American University of Cairo and Al-Azhar University, which is the preeminent institution of Sunni Islamic learning. He has traveled extensively in the Middle East. He's a frequent media commentator on threat finance, radical Islam. He's been publishing in influential media outlets, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and alarabia.net. Now, Avi is also a seasoned entrepreneur and author of 5 books, and he's going to tell us today about his most recent one, as I mentioned, Thou Shalt Innovate, How Israeli Ingenuity Repairs the World. It was published in 2018. By now, this book has been translated in over 40 languages around the world. This makes me really very jealous as an academic. My books are published in one language, and I'm happy if 40 people read them. But Avi's books have been translated already in 40 languages. So his reach is truly phenomenally global. Now, Avi is also a former official in the United States Departments of Treasury and Defense. Avi is a senior fellow at the American Foreign Policy Council and a member at the Council on Foreign Relations and the Young Presidents Organization. He's also the founder of IMS, which is a merchant processing company, which works with clients nationwide and also globally. In the past 2 decades, Avi has lectured around the world, has published articles, as I mentioned, in several eminent journals, but the number of such outlets where Avi's works have been published is just a staggering over 50. So we truly are so fortunate to be able to welcome such a distinguished, world-renowned, and sought-after person as Avi is here in Montreal, well, virtually so, at the Azrieli Institute of Israel Studies. Now, Jewish communities just a few weeks ago all over the world were reading, of course, in Parashat HaShavua, the 10 Commandments. Avi today is going to share with us the 11th commandment, Thou shalt innovate. So let's start this journey to see how Israel has been doing it. Avi, the floor is yours.
Csaba, thank you so much for that very, very kind introduction. I'll remember to keep that in mind when my children are angry and screaming at me. Your words will resonate in my head. Friends, with that bio, I will tell you, I did not always do technology as it relates to Israel. I was a very late comer to the ideas of technology. For the vast majority of my career, I dealt with primarily threat finance, radical Islam, and it was only in the summer of 2014 that my worldview in this regard really fundamentally changed. And it happened, I'll never forget, it really happened at the beginning of July 2014. I now have 3 children. At the time we had 2. And we left on July the 4th, 2014, and we arrived in Israel. And I went to enroll my then nearly 2-year-old at a preschool. And the owner of the preschool was shocked to see me, even though we had corresponded for many months ahead of time. And she said, Mr. Jorisch, what are you doing here? I said, I'm here to enroll my child at your preschool. She said, but haven't you heard? There's a war that's about to break out between Israel and Hamas. You ought to go home to America where it's nice and safe. It was my turn to look at her as if she had grown a third year. I said, we are home. Please enroll my child at your preschool. She did so, albeit reluctantly. And then a few days later, as a fairly young parent, I heard the scariest noise of my entire parental life. It was the sound of the code red heralding the beginning of war on the radio. And there, my stomach turned. I looked at my sleeping toddler in the back, and I knew exactly what was coming. It's one thing to come as an adult to an area of war. It's quite another to bring a toddler. And so we went to our home, and we did tubby time, and we did story time, and I put my child to bed, and I knew exactly what was coming. And sure enough, 3 hours later, the sirens wailed the beginning of war, and I took my terrified toddler down 4 flights of stairs into the bomb shelter. I will tell you that my neighbors looked more terrified than my toddler. And we stood there huddling for about 10 minutes. And after 10 minutes, our building violently shook. Friends, for those of you that were not around in Israel in the summer of 2014, that was the sound of history being made. That was up until that moment in time, a missile would go up and then it would come down. This missile had been fired from Gaza towards Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, which was a first. No missile had reached those two cities until that moment in time. And then history was made. The missile came up from Gaza, a second came up from Israel and met it in midair. That was the sound of history being made in terms of the Iron Dome. Up until then, we only saw such things in the movie theaters. We saw that in Star Wars. We didn't see that in real life. We heard these two massive booms and knew that it was safe to go back upstairs. And friends, I will tell you that series of events happened often over the course of the summer. We went into a lot of bomb shelters. And on the one hand, it was an extraordinarily inspiring summer because I, like all the citizens of the state of Israel, took comfort in the Iron Dome. On the other hand, it was extraordinarily depressing. In Syria, you had ISIS. Syria and Iraq, you had ISIS running around the countries. In Lebanon, you had Hezbollah that had a vice grip over Lebanon. You had ISIS running around the Sinai Peninsula. And of course, Hamas was shooting rockets and building tunnels. So on the one hand, very depressing. On the other hand, I began to realize that Israeli technology is improving the lives of not only millions of people, but billions of people in the realms of medicine, science, agriculture, water. And I knew that was a story that I needed to tell. And henceforth, my journey into technology. How is a country the size of New Jersey able to produce more startups combined than Canada, India, Japan, Korea, and the United Kingdom combined? How is it possible? What is the secret behind the fact that there are more companies listed on the NASDAQ, Israeli companies listed on the NASDAQ, than any other country other than China and the United States? And I needed to really dig into that story. And with your permission, I'll just share with you a few of the stories that I outline in Thou Shalt Innovate, which as Csaba pointed out, is done quite well around the world because there's a thirst for the secrets behind Israeli technology, and really the story that Israeli technology is playing an outsized contribution in making the world a better place and curing the sick, feeding the hungry, helping the needy. That is not a story that is often told in the news. I'll share with you a few of the stories from the book, and then I'll go through, as a result of all the interviews, where I really think, where does all this technology come from? So allow me to just start with one of my favorite stories, is the story of an organization called United Rescue. Now, for those of you who have been to Israel over the course of the last 15 years, you'll see all over the country these Vespas, orange or red, and you often scratch your head, what are these strange looking Vespas around the country? My friend and colleague, Eli Beer, he did a few extraordinary things, but primarily he revolutionized how emergency medicine is delivered in Israel. Let me just break that down for you. I live here in Washington, D.C. now, and on average, it takes 22 minutes. Were I to have a medical emergency of any kind, it takes 22 minutes on average for an ambulance to come to my home and save my life. That statistic holds true in many places around the world, including in Israel. Eli Beer said that's really far too long, and he did three things. The first is he banded together 6,000 EMTs, or emergency medical technicians. He trained them, and he basically connected them all. And I should point out that these are Muslims, Christians, and Jews. This is it is the wide gamut of the Israeli population. He gave each of them an amazing application in order to connect them to medical emergencies. Now, when I want to call a cab, when it's not COVID, I haven't taken a cab since since COVID. But in general, when we want to basically hail a cab, none of us really call a cab anymore. That's so 1975. We take out our magic smartphones, we press a button, and almost by magic, via Lyft, Get, Uber, arrives with a car at our home. Eli Beer, instead of calling cabs, he gave each of his emergency medical technicians, his EMTs, this smartphone application that geospatially locates the 5 nearest EMTs to the scene of a medical emergency. And in order to get to the scene, he gives them these red or orange Vespas. Friends, I don't know, I was not aware of this story until I wrote the book. The national average today, anywhere in the country, to get an EMT to the scene of an emergency, friends, I'm glad you're all sitting, anywhere in the country is 3 minutes. And in every major city of Israel, Tel Aviv, Haifa, Yerushalayim, Modi'in, Beersheva, it's 90 seconds. Friends, I don't get to say Scooby-Doo, and literally someone comes to save my life. Now, that would be incredible under any circumstances, but I will tell you that Eli Beer has now scaled up this model to 9 countries around the world, including the first city in the United States to get this was Jersey City, but there's no reason why we don't have this in every city around the world, in Montreal, in New York, in Washington, D.C., in Berlin, in Ankara, in. This is cheap, scalable technology. Friends, we have millions of emergency responders around the world. Every one of us is today connected using our smartphone, and I think we can all bend together a few shekels for these ambucycles. Pizza Hut does it in terms of delivering pizzas. There's no reason why we can't do it in terms of saving lives. The second extraordinary set of technologies that I want to talk today about is water. Israel is the world's first and only self-declared water superpower. That means that Israel is no longer reliant upon the weather or its neighbors for its water consumption. Israel has leveraged 5 different technologies in order to be water independent, essentially. The first, and some of these technologies were created in Israel, others were created abroad. All of them, really, the sum of the whole is greater than its parts, have led Israel to become a superpower water-wise. The first one I'd like to talk about is desalination. Desalination is taking salt water from the ocean and turning it into sweet drinking water. Israel today has 5 desalination plants, which provides over 60% of the country's potable water needs. In other words, it's drinking water. That technology was created in California in the early 1960s. But the man who created reverse osmosis made Aliyah. He moved to Israel and perfected it at Ben Gurion University. Now, that's interesting in and of itself, but the really interesting fact is that Israel has built over 400 desalination plants in 40 countries around the world, including the largest desalination plant in the Western Hemisphere, which is located in Carlsbad, California, the largest desalination plant in India, and the largest desalination plant in China. The second piece of technology is drip irrigation. Israel today created drip irrigation and is the world's leader today when it comes to drip irrigation. We created it in the mid-1960s, a man by the name of Simcha Blas. Drip irrigation is these small plastic tubes which emit a micro amount of water. It emits a third of the water and it doubles the yield. That technology today is used by over 1 billion farmers around the world. The third piece of technology that I'd love to talk about is recycling of wastewater. We all go to our toilets, and most of us don't think about what happens when we flush our toilets. Most water authorities around the world take the water that we flush, they clean it and sanitize it twice, and then they release that water back into our rivers and into our oceans. Israel does things a little bit differently. First of all, it removes the human waste, and then it is used as fertilizer. And then Israel cleans its water 5 times. Technically, you could drink that water, but the idea of drinking sewage water is a little disgusting, so Israel doesn't do it. But I can assure you, in the years to come, drinking sewage water will be coming to a tap near you. Israel recycles 90% of its wastewater. The next country down is Spain at 18%, and the United States roughly uses 6% of its recycled wastewater. Israel is a leader when it comes to this regard. And lastly, let's talk about the 2-button toilet. Button 1, button 2, number 1, number 2. For those of you who spend time in Europe and Israel, you know it's fairly standard in many parts around the world. Not so much in the United States where I live. But as a result of these technologies, Israel has become a water superpower. Let's talk about why that's important and where we're going over the course of the next 10 to 15 years. Egypt, a country that I lived in for not a small amount of time, with a population of 100 million people. By 2025, Egypt is going to run out of water. It is going to experience a water problem of biblical proportions. Very few people are talking about this. Egypt is literally on the precipice of a massive water emergency. Iran, a country today of 80 million people, which points its missiles in the direction of Israel, in the next 10 years, over 50% of its population will become water refugees. That is a term that we will hear with increasing numbers over the years to come. This is a trend line that continues throughout much of Europe and in the United States. 40 out of the 50 United States are going to experience water shortages over the course of the next 10 years. And Israel has basically leveraged many technologies and has much to share in this regard in terms of helping the world deal with this upcoming water crisis. I'll go through a few more technologies because I think that it's interesting, but we can certainly address any of the others that I feature in my book over the course of the Q&A. I feature in the book 15 and I tell their stories. And in the back, I feature an additional 50. The next one, which I love telling about, is for those of you who either have a friend or a colleague or yourself experience Parkinson's or a whole host of other neurological diseases like essential tremor, Tourette's, and others. Often those that are afflicted with these neurological diseases are treated using something called deep brain stimulation. Deep brain stimulation is taking an electrode and inserting it into the brain and pulsing it. It's like a pacemaker. It's like a heart pacemaker that is inserted into the brain. Deep brain stimulation was innovated in the 1980s by a Frenchman by the name of Alim Louis Ben Abid, but it took a professor from the Hebrew University, Hagai Bergman, to discover that in order to reduce the symptoms associated with Parkinson's, if you pulse the very back of the brain, the basal ganglia. The only problem is, if you don't hit the exact spot of the brain, you can either turn someone into a vegetable or kill them. And here comes in a very interesting piece of science. Scientists have discovered that every part of the human brain emits a unique sound signature. And so my friends and colleagues, Imad and Reem Yunus, Israeli Christian Arabs from Nazareth, created their company called Alpha Omega and have innovated the world's preeminent GPS for the brain, which allows brain surgeons all over the world in thousands of medical facilities to literally take that electrode and find the exact spot in the brain in order to pulse it. I'll share with you, if you allow me, one more story. We could talk about cherry tomatoes. We could talk about drugs for multiple sclerosis. We could talk about how planes don't hit birds, taking trees that have been extinct, bringing them back to life. I mean, there's a whole host of wonderful stories about curing the sick, feeding the hungry, helping the needy. The last story I'll share with you today is my friend and colleague, Amit Gofer, about 20 years ago, experienced a horrible ATV accident. He snapped his neck and he became a quadriplegic. In other words, he lost the use of his arms and of his legs, and he became depressed. He realized that he would never, ever walk again. And he started doing a tremendous number of Google searches. We all as humans have something called a skeleton on the inside of our bodies. And he was curious if there were any animals in nature that had a skeleton on the outside of their bodies. And were he to create a skeleton on the outside of our body, would that allow humans that are either quadriplegics or paraplegics to walk again? Of course, he discovered very quickly that there are animals on the planet, like armadillos, crabs, scorpions, lobsters, that have this skeleton on the outside of their body, which is technically known as an exoskeleton. And he created, for those of you that haven't seen this, I'd encourage you after our Zoom talk today to go online and look at the YouTube. He created this device that is a battery on the back, which you carry, and it hugs the legs. And he discovered that about 10 years ago, the world's first paraplegic stood up and literally was able to see their loved ones at eye level and walk around. Now, if that wasn't amazing enough, I think it was about 5 or 6 years ago that the world's first paraplegic stood up, walked, and then ran the London Marathon. And since, we've seen hundreds of paraplegics running marathons all over the world. Now, the great irony of this all, of course, is that Amit Gopher himself, a quadriplegic, was unable to benefit from his own innovation. And so 3 years ago, he created a new device called the Up and Ride. The Up and Ride, I'm sure all of you have seen Segway devices, you know, the ones that you kind of stand upright that have the wheels on the side. He created a Segway device for quadriplegics that allows these individuals to stand up and see their loved ones at eye level. It's extraordinarily, it's heartening, it's emotional. I have to admit that when I see these videos, I get super, super emotional. And all this begs the question, how? How does the country so small play an outsized contribution to curing the sick, feeding the hungry, and helping the needy? And I started asking that very question of hundreds of professors, private equity, venture capitalists, innovators themselves. What was their secret? Where does this come from? And ultimately, I like to say that the secret of Israel's success lies in 4 areas. The first is diversity. Diversity powers the Israeli technological ecosystem. Israel is a country that has tremendous number of Christians, Muslims, and Jews. Let's talk about Muslims of every stripe and of every variety: Sunni, Shia, Circassian, Arab, Bedouin, Christians, Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, Catholics, Protestants, Russian Orthodox. I mean, really the gamut. You have Jews from the 4 corners of the world. The second is failure. Failure is baked in to the system. We all know it. None of us likes it. But in order to succeed, you must fail and fail and fail and fail. And in Israel, failing is not seen as a negative, as a negative attribute, but rather it's a necessary part of the technological advancement of society. The third is secular values. There's this idea that we must have these secular institutions in order to succeed. And by that, the 2 biggest secular institutions in the country that are revered, the first are all but one of the universities in Israel are secular. And the military, for the most part, is a secular institution. The last secret of Israel's success, and I would like to talk about this in very, very cultural terms, is the prophetic tradition. For the last 3,900 years, the children of Israel, the Jewish people, have had a strong prophetic tradition that calls upon the people of Israel to cure the sick, feed the hungry, and help the needy. For the last 2,000 years or so, 1,500 years, religious Jews have been praying something called the Aleinu prayer 3 times a day, which calls upon us to repair the world in the image of God. V'taken olam b'malachut Shaddai. The Mishnah, one of the preeminent books of Judaic teachings, which really underlies the rabbinic law, no less than 10 times implores us to engage in something called tikkun olam, the idea of repairing the world. The prophet Isaiah calls upon us all, not just Jews, all, to bring more light to the world. This idea of light unto the nations, I really feel, has been misunderstood to some degree. The central teaching here is to bring more light to the world. Really, this idea of how do we make the world a better place? On Saturday night, between the time that we make a distinction between the Holy Sabbath and the rest of the week, the blessing that we make is lahavdil ben kodesh lechol ve'or lechoshech. The idea of distinguishing between the holiness and the mundane and darkness and light. And these ideas of curing the sick, feeding the hungry, helping the needy, you cannot repeat these ideas and making the world a better place. You cannot repeat this 3 times a day, every day, for thousands of years without that having a deep cultural impact on the DNA of your people. And Israel now is a primarily Jewish state, or I should say, really a state that is the home of the Jews, today a Jewish state, really embodies this idea of curing the sick, feeding the hungry, helping the needy. And the founders of the state of Israel were deeply, deeply influenced by this idea. Ben Gurion stood at the lectern, Israel's first prime minister, stood at the lectern roughly 72 years ago, and he said 2 extraordinary things. The first, he said, if you're a member of the Jewish faith, after 2,000 years, your moment has arrived. You are welcome to come home. The gates are open. And that is enshrined in Israel's national anthem, Hatikva. Hatikva bat shnot alpayim. The hope has been around for 2,000 years, and those gates from the diaspora are officially open to come home. The second thing that he said, and I quote, he said, Israel has been granted the great privilege and the obligation to tackle some of the gravest challenges of the 20th century. He seemed to be saying that the most sublime hope of the state of Israel was not only to protect and enrich the citizens of the state, but also to go beyond the borders of the state of Israel and make the world a better place. And I will tell you, Israel is doing that today, leveraging its technology far and wide. Friends, I don't want you to walk away thinking that Israel is the most technologically advanced place on the planet. Let me be clear. It is not a paradise. As much as I love Israel and as much as I want to spend time and go back and forth, Israel is not the most amazing place on the planet. Technologically speaking, according to the Bloomberg Index, it's only number 5. So we should have a little bit of humility in terms of the technological prowess of the state of Israel. With that said, I'd say that's very, very impressive after 72 years of existence, that it has more startups combined than Canada, India, Japan, Korea, and the United Kingdom combined. I would say the place that Israel really does shine are the technologies that are focused on curing the sick, feeding the hungry, and helping the needy. And that really is where Israel is making this huge, outsized contribution. Allow me to share with you a personal story. And for those of you who have read either my books or the op-eds that I publish, I spend a lot of time thinking about how to educate my children and writing stories about them. This one is no exception. This one took place about 5 years ago. I came home from work, and the mother of my children gave me that look that all men are absolutely terrified of. And I knew immediately that something was wrong. And she asked my 5-year-old to tell me what naughty thing he had done that day. And I can tell you, 5-year-olds don't like sharing with their daddies what naughty things they've done. And so the mother of my children came up to me and she whispered in my ear, she said, your son told a homeless person that he's a very bad man. Now, I will tell you, I come from a family of Holocaust survivors. And I had just basically finished, or I was in the process of writing the book. And so I thought of the innovators that I featured in my book. And I thought of my grandparents. And I asked my son to get his shoes on and his jacket on. It was March. It's cold in Washington, D.C. in March. And so we walked out the door. And he says to me, Daddy, where are we going? I said, we're going to go on a little mission, Aiden. And we got about halfway down the block. And I sat down on the curb. And I looked him in eye level. And I said, Aiden, why did you tell that homeless person that he was a bad man? And my child didn't know the answer to that question. And so I pressed very, very gently. I said, was it because he was black? Was it because he was surrounded by plastic bags? Was it because he smelled like urine? Why would you say such a thing? He didn't know the answer to that question. And so I took one more step. I said, Aiden, what are the 5 rules that we have in our home? Because in my home, we only have 5 rules. Actually, we've now, in recent years, we've added a 6th, but at the time it was 5. And he all too gladly told me what the rules were. The first rule in our home is to be a mensch, not a wilde chaya. For those of you who don't speak Yiddish, being a mensch means to be a good person, and to be a wilde chaya literally means to be a wild animal. I said, very good, Aiden. Be a mensch, not a wilde chaya. And I will tell you, just as a sidebar, just before COVID, I took my youngest, who was 3 or 4 at the time, to visit my mother in Miami. And we marched through the door, and my 3 or 4-year-old marches in. He says, Savta, which means grandma in Yiddish, or Hebrew. Savta, I'm a mensch, not a wilde chaya. I can assure you, all small children and certainly adults know the difference between being mensches and being wilde chayas. The second rule is to do our part to make the world a better place. The third rule is to try your very, very hardest. The fourth rule is to never, ever give up. And the 5th rule is try and have a good time. In recent years, we've added one more. Your word is your bond. You do what you say and you say what you'll do. But I will tell you, Aiden did that beautifully, and I was very, very proud. I said, excellent job. What do we do when we make a mistake? He said, Daddy, we do tzedakah. I said, very good. Tzedakah, friends, is generally translated into English as charity. But the truth of the matter is, the root of that word, tzedakah, tzedek, doesn't mean charity, but it literally means justice. And in this particular instance, it means social justice. I said, good job. Here's the way this is going to go. First, we're going to find that homeless person. The second, I want you to go right up to them. I want you to shake their hand, look him in the eye, say, God bless you and keep you safe, and hand him a couple dollars. Aiden said he could do that. So we walked a few more blocks, and we found it was actually a group of 3 homeless people. And Aiden, and I'll tell you, the scene was not a particularly happy scene. It was dark. It was smelly. It was not, you could tell this was really not a happy place. My then 5-year-old marches right up to these individuals. He looks this person in the eye. He shakes their hand. He says, God bless you and keep you safe. And he hands them a couple of dollars. And do you know what happens? Friends, we have a very, very awkward moment of silence. This homeless person is looking at my child. My child is looking at this homeless person. And then do you know what happens? This individual literally, he bear hugs my child. He's hugging him. He's high-fiving him. You're a little angel. You're such a good little boy. There's all these smiles. You realize this is the first human interaction these individuals have had in a very, very long time. After a few minutes, we thank them for their time and we walk away. And after walking a few feet, I kneel down again. And I ask Aiden, I say, Aiden, what just happened here? And Aiden thinks for a moment. He says, Daddy, I made the world a better place and it feels good. And when I think about that story, and I think about the Jewish people in the state of Israel, I'm reminded that our sages teach us that the world is built on 3 things: Torah, Avodah, and Gmilut Chasadim. The world is built on Torah, which we translate into the Bible, but the essence of that is values. The world is built on good values. The Jewish people don't have the intellectual property locked down on values. That is a universal human yearning. Muslims, Christians, Jews, Sikh, Hindus, Buddhists, that's universal. The second is hard work, avodah. No one would have believed 72 years ago today that Israel has all these startups and that Israel is the startup nation. It's hard work. The third is Gmilut Chasadim, the ideas of acts of charity and kindness. Israel is leveraging charity and acts of kindness using its technology. Now, friends, Israel, as I said before, is not a paradise. Israel has more problems than you know what to do with. Problems between the very rich and the very poor, problems between Israel and its Arab neighbors, problems with resource scarcity. The country doesn't lack for problems. I don't mean to suggest that Israel is the most wonderful place on the planet. All I want you to walk away with from today is that Israel is a place, this is a story that is not often told and is one of the central stories of the state of Israel, this idea of tech for good, tech that is curing the sick, feeding the hungry, and helping the needy. Now, friends, in the next 10 years, we're going to experience extraordinary things. Over the course of the next 10 years, virtual reality and reality are going to be indistinguishable from one another. In 10 years' time, I believe scientists are going to cure Parkinson's, multiple sclerosis, and almost all neurological diseases. In the next 10 years, we're going to have bases on the moon. And 10 years after that, friends, we're going to be what they call, hopefully, terraforming Mars. We will have bases on Mars at the beginning of making that a habitable planet. Friends, over the course of the next 10 to 20 years, we are going to face perhaps our most challenging, but most amazing days are going to face humanity. We're at an inflection point in time. We have massive, massive grand global challenges when it comes to water, food, artificial intelligence, space, education, energy, poverty, security, tremendous challenges. But also for the first time in history, we have the ability, perhaps the first time in history, we have the ability to solve these grand global challenges. And I challenge you to look at any of these grand global challenges, and I believe you will find Israel is at the forefront of trying to solve one of those grand global challenges. And that is personally what inspires me. The future belongs to countries that are innovating, but specifically innovating in order to make the world a better place. Now, friends, I'll leave you with a few final thoughts. I don't expect any of you to go out and build the next amazing startup that's going to solve a grand global challenge. That's not the point of this talk. At the end of this talk, I hope that you will, when you shut the Zoom, I hope that you will think about a few things. The first, if you've not been to Israel recently, I hope that you will go. And I don't only want you to go and see all the places that we all normally go and see. I want you to go and see the Kotel and go to Tel Aviv and go to Masada, go to all the places that those of us who go on a regular basis go. But I want you to take your children and I want you to take your grandchildren to see the places that you don't normally go to. I want you to see the headquarters of United Rescue, where you can see Muslims, Christians, and Jews that are fighting together to save lives. I want you to go to the Weizmann Institute, where you can see where the drugs are being produced to help solve multiple sclerosis and Parkinson's. I want you to go to Nazareth and meet Imad and Reem Yunus that have created the GPS for the brain. Friends, I want you to see these innovations for yourselves, because if you don't see it, you can't possibly believe it. The stories that I feature in my book, they're not only good stories, they are the reality of what's happening in Israel today. So that's number one. Number two, I want you to think about what can you yourself do in order to make the world a better place? What can you do to bring more light to the world? I wake up every day and I try and do a few things. The first is I say Shechianu. That's the blessing that basically gives thanks to God. Well, I shall admit, I don't know where I stand vis-a-vis the whole idea of God. That's a whole other subject. But I basically wake up every day and I give great thanks for being in this moment in time. And my grandparents were Holocaust survivors, and I basically live in a reality where I see the world as becoming a better place, where we are curing the sick, feeding the hungry, helping the needy, and humanity is solving grand global challenges, and Israel is at the forefront of that. So I want you to think, what can you personally do in order to bring more light to the world? And that can be something as very simple as holding the door open for someone else, visiting the sick, or frankly, smiling at somebody else. What can you do to bring more light? And the second thing I want you to think about is as follows. As I told you, Ben-Gurion said, Israel's been granted the great privilege and the obligation to tackle some of the gravest challenges of the 20th century. Friends, we have collectively, all of us, have been granted the great privilege and obligation to tackle some of the challenges of the 21st century. Now, Csaba, when I visit you in Berlin or Jerusalem or Montreal, I know that my book is on your bookshelf. You would do me the great privilege if when I came to your home, my book was not on your bookshelf. I want you to give the book to somebody else. Friends, I hope that you will read this book. I hope that you will be inspired by it. And then please give it to your children and give it to your grandchildren, because they are the next generation. Hand the baton to somebody else. I will tell you, before I put my children to bed at night, these are the stories that I tell them, because the world, I believe, is a wonderful place, and it is an inspiring place. And we have this great privilege and obligation to make the world better. And the individuals that I feature in my book, these are the individuals, or these are among the individuals that are making the world a better place, and pass these stories onwards to the next generation and inspire them. With that, I will close, and I'll gladly take any of your questions.
Avi, thank you so very much. It's not so often that we actually get to know the person, not just the material that is being presented, but the person. And thank you for opening up yourself to us. You clearly are, you're one of a kind who actually walks the talk.
You're kind.
And that is beautiful.
Thank you.
Let me confess, I did already, partly at least, what you, maybe that's in the prophetic tradition, I foresaw what you would ask me to do. I lent the book to a dear friend, Shoshana, in Jerusalem, but I wanted it back. So now it's back on my bookshelf. Next time I will actually give it to someone. And it's funny enough, one of the questions that are coming in the chat is actually about that. The book is sold out on Amazon, so where can we get it? So maybe that's a practical piece of advice that we can share with people.
You normally can get it on Amazon, Noble. If it's sold out, it's only for, you go back and, is it really sold out? That's amazing. I mean, look, I will tell you, the book, the book actually is doing, as you mentioned, is doing.
We are Canadian Amazon, that's why.
I see. Okay, so then the Canadian Amazon, then go on the US Amazon. It should easily order it from there.
So let me just ask members of the audience, friends, please send us your questions in the chat. I am going to be diligently monitoring the questions that are coming in. Depending on the angle, depending on the question, I may decide to package them and in order to give Avi an opportunity to maybe tackle more in one go. There are some already coming in, but let me just take advantage of my opportunity to actually fire away some of the questions that I would like to hear you reflect on, Avi, and maybe that will be also beneficial to our friends. I would like to ask you two questions that in a very topical sense relate to what you presented to us about with Israeli reality in the world today. One of them has to do with your website. Your website, your webpage actually has an Arabic version, which is wonderful. I'm not surprised knowing your bio, and you're very connected with the Arab world, with the Islamic world. Can you tell us about how in the Arab world, this Israel that you are telling us about
He froze.
Was the Arab world able to reach out to you in order to get more information or just get to know the Israel that you have presented to us about today? And the second question is taking this topic into a slightly different direction. But you did mention something, you mentioned many important things, but one particular point that really spoke to me has to do with Israel's ability and the importance of Israel leveraging its technological know-how, its R&D, its the fruits of its innovation in the world. So against that background, the news that got us all excited and sad, those of us studying and of course caring about Israel, of course the decision of the ICC, the International Criminal Court, suggests that the olam that we are trying to letaken would actually come to think of Israel differently. So how do you, as the author of this fantastic fantastic book. Reconcile this tremendous commitment to Tikkun Olam and innovation, which Israel should be able to leverage for a different reception and portrayal in the world, with something like what's coming from the ICC today. Like the two are just in conflict. It shouldn't be happening. So take it or leave it. You don't have to, because many questions are coming in. So please.
Let me see if I'll try and address both. So first, the Arabic version of the book. For me, I felt important that the book come out in Arabic for free to download online. Now, I will tell you, I monitor with some regularity the number of copies that are downloaded for free, and it's extraordinary. The number of copies that have been downloaded really it is a very significant number of copies have been downloaded, which really is very heartening. The Arab world is a big place. I think the proof is in the pudding. For the last X number of years, I've been predicting that Israel will make peace with some of its Arab neighbors, besides, of course, Jordan and Egypt. And today we are seeing the Abraham Accords with Morocco, with Sudan, with Bahrain, and with the UAE. And friends, I believe this is just the very, very beginning, which naturally leads me to the second part of your question. Look, Israel has had a very challenging past. There's no lack of unfortunately anti-Semitism in the world, and I believe that plays a strong part. Csaba, if you allow me, I'm going to go into a part of the story that you have not. It's really it's a personal part of the story. Today, I don't normally talk about my background in a deep way. Today, I published a piece in the Institute for Global Anti-Semitism and Policy, which is coming out of the Jerusalem Post at the end of the week. A week and a half ago, the mezuzah from my door in my home was stolen. Okay, this is something that has never, ever happened to me in all the years of my life. Okay, it has never happened that mezuzah has been stolen from my door. I live on Capitol Hill. I will tell you that every few months, not just me, but all of my neighbors, and with a few square blocks, get an anti-Semitic flyer. Clearly someone who's deranged puts these things in front of all the doors. And with all the events that have been happening in Washington recently, the mezuzah on my door was stolen. Now, that really did surprise me. That I did not expect. And on the one hand, I found it extraordinarily violating, disturbing, unacceptable. On the other hand, I used it as an extraordinary moment for teaching with my children. And the idea of how do you broach anti-Semitism in a teachable way to the next generation, I think dovetails to your question very nicely. And so with my children, I started with the question of, first of all, do they know what anti-Semitism is? What is anti-Semitism? My children are 10, 8, and 5.5. Obviously, my 5.5-year-old was not able to articulate that, but my 10 and my 8-year-olds were. And we used it as a moment to really talk about what are hate crimes, and eventually decided to put the mezuzah back on the door and really give charity back to certain individuals, specifically an organization that was fighting anti-Semitism, an organization that was working on extinct rhinos in Africa. Those are these charities that my children wanted to really give back to. When it comes to the ICC, I think part of it is you have here a confluence of a few different sad realities. The first, that Israel has had a very challenging history with its Arab neighbors. The second is that anti-Semitism is here to stay and is not going away anytime soon. And the third is you have this anti-Israel, anti-Semitic left, right, and radical Islam. And I think all that feeds unfortunately, into the ICC when you look at the international community and lobbying efforts that are taking place. With that said, in the next 10 years, I really expect we will see a very, very different reality. We will see many more Arab countries coming out of the fold and making peace in Israel and helping solve these grand global challenges: water, energy, food security. And I think you will find that the UN and the European Union and other places, including the ICC, you'll find it to be a much more hospitable place, but you'll find a different interaction with the state of Israel in the years to come. And we're already seeing that trend. It just takes time for it to build into place. But if I look into my crystal ball, these are things that are already changing and will continue to change for the benefit. You cannot, when you have a country like Israel that is innovating at such a high level, and specifically innovating to make the world a better place, I believe this is the beginning.
Thank you, Avi. So Avi, let me just read out the next 3 questions. They are coming at you from different angles. some I think you have already reflected on, but nonetheless, let me share them with you and with the audience, and you will decide how to answer. So Randy Pinsky. Randy is a former student of our university. It's wonderful to see Randy back here at this event. Would like to ask you more broadly about the diplomatic impact of these beneficial advancements. I think you have answered this already in important ways, but if you would like to add, of course, please do. The next one.
And I want to say that if you want to look at water, just look at some of the countries that Israel does not have diplomatic relationships with, where it is managed to use and leverage. Just as for an example, water technologies, Israel has built 400 desalination plants around the world, and in some places it's not had diplomatic relationship with. So we are seeing that the technology is going ahead of diplomacy in many, many regards.
Great. We have Ms. Lillian Weinberg-Goodman from the community, complimenting you on a wonderful presentation. And she promises that she will read and share your stories widely. And here's the question. Have you added any information about the medical drones? Ms. Weinberg-Goodman just saw an amazing video of a heart attack victim in Israel who was saved by his daughter calling 911. And the drone with pads and directions of how to use them saved him so quickly, even faster than the orange and red scooters. So if you have any comments on medical drones or anything related, please share them with us. And a very interesting sociological, domestic political question from Ms. Eleanor Bonder. How do you relate to Israel's lack of full acceptance of liberal Jews and allowing women to pray with the Torah at the Western Wall? Right? It's a different kind of Israeli culture than what you have told us about. So you have your challenge.
All right, so I'll start with the drones. First of all, I always love writing op-eds. The drones is one of these things I'll be writing about in the months to come. I find it really is, it's again, these medical technologies and tech in general, I find super interesting, and drones is really the beginning of the next generation. Look, I think the idea of liberal Judaism and its interaction with Israel is wonderfully addressed. If you've not read Never Alone by Natan Sharansky, I think Gil Troy is speaking to this group in the weeks ahead. I want you to know, I think it's one of the most wonderful books that has come out recently and is a seminal book, and encourage you to read it. He really devotes a tremendous amount of time to this particular issue. I am not well positioned to answer that question. All that is to say, all I will say is that I hope, like all of you, Israel over the course of the years to come will be in this regard, a more pluralistic, liberal place. Israel and world Jewry have developed and taken lessons from history in slightly different ways. Its relationship to Judaism and liberal Judaism is very, very different. This is certainly a huge challenge for Israel to solve in the years to come. I will tell you that in this regard, Israel needs world Jewry just as much as world Jewry needs Israel. And this is one of the many areas where Israel can work with world Jewry for the benefit of the country.
I think it also connects very nicely with the importance that you attach to diversity. So whatever keeps the country diverse, pluralistic, will of course be of utmost importance to keeping it.
It is the Jewish. It is the Jewish state. It's the state for really. It is a state for the Jewish people, and the Jewish people is not one monolithic block. And all stripes and all shades and all varieties. This is our ancestral homeland, and Israel, in this regard, has work to do in order to really welcome in a wide variety of communities to feel much more at home in Israel. This Israel has work to do. You know, Israel, I always say that Israel is striving to become a more perfect union. It is not a perfect place by any stretch of the imagination. This is one of those places where Israel has to work to become a more perfect union.
Avi, I can't thank you enough for making yourself available, for taking time away from your family, from teaching your children and the world the importance of Tikkun Olam, sharing us the importance of the 11th commandment. I will always call it this way from now on, Shalt Innovate. and just for being with us and being so wonderful. Before I would say goodbye,
I will put my email in the chat. If anyone has any questions, you certainly can know where to find me. I'm fairly accessible in that regard. If you've read the book, I ask that you, if you wouldn't mind, leave an Amazon review. That would be much appreciated. And share the book with your friends.
That we promise, and we will not just lend the book. We will actually share the book with our friends and colleagues. Friends, let me give my cue to Jennifer to please put up our closing slides so that we could tease some of the important upcoming events with you. In the next coming weeks and months that we still have left from the semester, we are going to have some really exciting scholars, speakers joining us. In March, we are going to be welcoming a local scholar in Montreal from McGill University, Professor Yael Halevi-Weiss, who will be talking to us about some of her insights from her hot off the press book about Israeli author Aleph Bet Yehoshua. Our information, of course, will be widely disseminated on social media, and you can also find more information on our website. Also in March, we are going to be having a very special conversation with Francine Zuckerman, who will be joining us from New Zealand at the time. And we will also make her recent film After Munich available for your viewing and streaming shortly before the conversation. The movie tells the story of 4 women whose lives were interrupted and affected by the murder of the Israeli athletes at the Munich Olympic Games. Of course, it's a Canadian film by a Canadian movie maker, so there's a very important way in which Canada and Israel will come together in that conversation. And also in March, we are going to be starting a new series at the Institute from Montreal to Jerusalem. And with this, we actually would like to share with you stories of friends from the community, from different parts of the community who made Aliyah, who moved to Israel, and who are contributing and who are shaping Israeli society, Israeli economy, Israeli politics and culture in different ways. Our initial guests will include Jason and Rachel Rosenblatt, Jason Rosenblatt and Rachel Lemish. Then we'll be very fortunate to have a conversation and a meeting with member of Knesset Michal Kotler-Wunsch. And as Avi already teased, Professor Gil Troy, formerly from McGill University, will be joining us. And all our guests in this series will be telling us about their experiences, their contributions to that diversity that Avi so beautifully depicted and showed us a portrait of. I would like to, in closing, say a huge thank you to my wonderful assistants at the Institute, Jennifer Solomon, who is making these slides work as beautifully as they do and always. And of course, Lisa Komlos, who is helping us with promoting our events on social media. So Jennifer and Lisa, thank you ever so much for doing all the great work that you do. But above all, Avi, thank you so much for joining us today and for sharing us the importance of Israeli innovation. Friends, looking forward to seeing all of you at our next and forthcoming events. Please look after your loved ones, keep up social distancing so that we could all defeat this terrible pandemic together. Bye, everyone. Thank you, Avi.